In 2008, Eddie Lampert, the billionaire hedge fund manager who controlled Sears, gathered the leadership of the most storied retailer in American history and told them they would no longer work together. He broke the company into more than 30 separate business units, each with its own president, its own board of directors, its own marketing chief, and its own profit and loss statement. From that day forward, the appliance division and the tool division and the clothing division would not cooperate. They would compete. They would bid against one another for floor space, for advertising dollars, for the company's own shared services, as if they were rival corporations that happened to share a parking lot rather than parts of a single firm. Lampert, a devoted reader of the novelist Ayn Rand, believed the invisible hand of the market would make each unit sharper and the whole company stronger. He ran Sears the way he ran a hedge fund, as a portfolio of competing bets, and he did most of it remotely, by video link from his estates in Florida and Connecticut, rarely setting foot inside an actual store. The executives in the room did not yet know what this would do to them. Within a few years, they would be describing their own company as a collection of warring tribes. That decision, handed down by a financier who saw a company as a spreadsheet rather than a community, was the moment Sears began to die in earnest. You would not have guessed that this company was capable of dying at all if you had seen it at its height. Sears in the middle of the 20th century was not a retailer. Sears was the retailer. It was the largest store chain on the planet, employing around 350,000 people at its peak. 1 in every 200 working Americans drew a paycheck from Sears. At one point, it was estimated that the company's catalog and stores touched the life of nearly every household in the country. When the company decided it needed a new headquarters in 1969, it did not build an office tower. It built the tallest building in the world. The Sears Tower rose 110 stories over Chicago, reaching 1,454 feet, and when it opened in 1973, it claimed the title of the tallest building on Earth, a distinction it would hold for 25 years. And Sears did not just sell other companies' products. It manufactured American life. Its Craftsman tools were in half the garages in the country. Its Kenmore appliances ran in the nation's kitchens and laundry rooms. Its Die-Hard batteries started America's cars. And its Allstate insurance protected them, a brand Sears created in 1931 that grew into one of the largest insurers in the United States. The company even sold homes. Between 1908 and 1940, Sears shipped tens of thousands of complete, build-it-yourself houses by mail, entire kit homes delivered in boxcars. Generations of children learned to want at Christmas by paging through the Sears wish book. For most of a century, the phrase used to describe the company was simple and total. Sears was where America shopped. To understand how a company that dominant could be broken apart from the inside, you have to understand what Sears was when it began, and why the thing that made it great was the one thing its final owner never seemed to grasp. To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1886. Richard Warren Sears was a railroad station agent, a young man who sold tickets and managed freight at a small depot. One day, a shipment of pocket watches arrived that a local jeweler refused to accept. Rather than send them back, Sears bought the watches himself and sold them, at a profit, to other station agents up and down the rail line. Within 6 months, he had made $5,000, a small fortune at the time, and he understood something about the country he lived in that most merchants had missed. America was mostly rural. Farmers and small-town families bought what they needed from local general stores that carried a thin selection at high prices, often on credit, with no way to know if they were being cheated. Richard Sears saw that the railroad and the postal system had quietly created something new, a way to reach every one of those families directly. That was the founding insight, and it changed American life. Sears moved to Chicago, hired a watch repairman named Alva Roebuck, and in 1893, the two formally created Sears, Roebuck and Company. Then, Sears did the thing that built the empire. He printed a catalog. Not a thin pamphlet, but a thick book that listed thousands of products at clearly stated, honest prices and mailed it to the farms and villages of America. By 1894, the catalog ran to 322 pages. The next year, it ran to 532. It offered sewing machines, bicycles, stoves, tools, clothing, eyeglasses, and eventually entire houses, delivered by rail in 2 boxcars with an instruction manual that a family could assemble themselves. The catalog was so central to rural life that people called it the consumer's Bible, and in the days of outhouses, its well-thumbed pages served a second, humbler purpose. Nobody printed in the advertising. It worked because of timing as much as genius. The United States government introduced rural free delivery in 1896 and parcel post in 1913. And suddenly, the entire countryside was wired into a delivery network that Sears was perfectly built to exploit. A farmer in a town with one overpriced general store could now buy almost anything a city dweller could buy at a fair price, with a money-back guarantee, and have it delivered to the nearest depot. The catalog broke the local merchant's monopoly. It gave a family in rural Nebraska the same access and nearly the same prices as a family in Chicago. Sears had built a way to sell everything to everyone, everywhere, decades before anyone imagined a computer. It was, in every meaningful sense, the Amazon of its century, and it created the very expectation of abundance and choice that American retail has chased ever since. The company nearly broke under its own success. The Panic of 1893 plunged the country into a deep depression at almost the exact moment Sears was getting started, and by 1895, the firm was choking on unsold merchandise and a brutal cash squeeze. Richard Sears was a marketing genius but a chaotic manager. A colleague once said he could sell a breath of air, and that was the problem. He promised goods in the catalog that he did not have in stock, then scrambled to fill the orders when they flooded in. One customer wrote in to beg him to stop shipping sewing machines, complaining that 5 had already arrived. The strain of running this beautiful, overheating machine was so great that Alva Roebuck, exhausted and uneasy with the financial risks his partner kept taking, sold his share of the company and walked away. Sears badly needed someone who could impose order on the chaos he had built. He found that man in Julius Rosenwald, a Chicago clothing manufacturer who bought into the firm and brought with him the one thing Sears completely lacked: discipline. Rosenwald built a mail-order plant in Chicago so efficient it could process tens of thousands of orders a day, using a color-coded, assembly line scheduling system that Henry Ford's people would later come to study. By 1906, Sears was handling 20,000 orders a day and 100,000 a day during the Christmas season, from what was then the largest commercial building in the world. When a sharp depression hit in 1921 and the company posted a staggering loss, Rosenwald personally donated millions in his own stock to shore up the company's finances and save it. He believed in the institution more than his own fortune. This is the partnership that built the empire, and it is worth holding on to, because it is the exact thing Lampert would later destroy. Richard Sears and Julius Rosenwald were opposites. Sears believed in relentless expansion and the hard sell. Rosenwald believed in caution, organization, and consolidation. They argued. They did not always get along. But they pulled in the same direction, each supplying what the other lacked, and the company they built grew so dominant that when it opened its first retail store in 1925 and began covering America in physical locations, it became and stayed the largest retailer in the United States for the better part of a century. Cooperation between people who saw the world differently was not a weakness in that story. It was the entire engine of it. The company's genius was that it kept reinventing itself without losing that unity. As America changed, Sears changed with it. When the country began moving off the farm and into the cities and the new suburbs, the catalog alone was no longer enough, and in 1925, Sears opened its first retail store. Under the leadership of a former Army general named Robert Wood, who understood that the automobile was reshaping where people lived and shopped, Sears planted department stores near the new roads and parking lots of suburban America, often anchoring the very shopping centers that would define post-war consumer life. The stores worked because they carried the same trusted house brands the catalog had made famous, Craftsman and Kenmore and the rest, and because the whole organization still functioned as one. A customer who trusted the Sears name in the catalog trusted it on the storefront, in the appliance aisle, in the auto center, and in the insurance policy, all of it reinforcing a single promise. By the middle of the 20th century, Sears was not merely a store. It was a fixture of American citizenship, as familiar as the post office, woven into the daily life of nearly every family in the nation. To understand why a company this enduring could be killed by its own owner, you have to understand what Eddie Lampert actually believed about how a business should work. This is the part that most people miss. Eddie Lampert did not come from retail, he came from Wall Street. He had trained on the risk arbitrage desk at Goldman Sachs under Robert Rubin, the future Treasury Secretary, founded his own hedge fund, ESL Investments, and joined the ranks of billionaires by the age of 41, managing a fund worth billions. He was hailed as a financial prodigy, called the next Warren Buffett and the Steve Jobs of the investing world. In 2003, he seized control of the bankrupt discount chain Kmart, buying up its debt and converting it into ownership. And in 2004 and 2005, he used Kmart to buy the older, grander Sears for around $11 to $12 billion, merging the two into a new entity called Sears Holdings with himself as chairman and, in time, chief executive. At first, it looked like it might work. The familiar post-acquisition playbook of aggressive cost-cutting and store closures produced a burst of profitability, and for a moment, Wall Street believed Lampert had pulled off a turnaround. But the early gains came from cutting, not building, and there is a limit to how long a retailer can shrink its way to health. Lampert ran the company in a way no traditional retail chief ever had. He was intensely private, almost reclusive, having once been kidnapped from the parking lot of his own office and held for ransom before talking his way free, and he governed Sears largely from a distance. He spent much of his time at his homes in Florida and Connecticut, addressing executives through video screens, demanding they justify their numbers like analysts defending positions to a fund manager. He trusted data and incentives over instinct and experience, and he was openly skeptical of the retail lifers who had spent careers learning how stores actually breathe. He had taken control of two of the most recognized brands in the country, brands built over more than a century, and he intended to run them not like stores, but like a portfolio. And this is where Eddie Lampert made the decision that would define everything that followed. Lampert's deepest conviction was ideological. He was a committed admirer of Ayn Rand, the novelist whose philosophy holds that selfishness is a virtue and that the pursuit of individual self-interest produces the best outcomes for everyone. He named his 288-foot luxury yacht the Fountainhead after one of her novels. And he believed, sincerely, that the central planning inside ordinary corporations was a kind of hidden socialism that made them slow, bloated, and stupid. Inside a normal company, he saw waste, divisions that propped each other up, costs that were shared and therefore never scrutinized, executives who could hide a failing unit behind a successful one. If the divisions of Sears were instead forced to compete against each other like independent companies in a free market, he reasoned, each one would be forced to behave rationally, justify every dollar and sharpen its own performance, and the whole would become stronger than the sum of its parts. He even hired Paul Di Podesta, the statistician made famous by the book and film Moneyball, convinced that better internal data and relentless internal competition would give Sears the kind of edge that unconventional metrics had given baseball. There was a logic to it, the cold and tidy logic of a man who had spent his career on a trading desk, where every position stands alone and is judged on its own return. But a retailer is not a portfolio of independent bets. A customer who walks into a Sears does not experience 30 companies. They experience one store where the appliances and the tools and the clothes are supposed to work together to make them want to stay and spend. The thing that had built Sears was precisely the cooperation Lampert saw as weakness. To Eddie Lampert, the warring of his own divisions was not a danger to be managed. It was the entire point of the design. There was a cruel irony in the timing, and it forms the first great ignored warning of the story. At the very moment Lampert took control, the threat that would define the next 2 decades of retail was already visible to anyone willing to look. Walmart had passed Sears as America's largest retailer back in 1989, beating it relentlessly on price and logistics. And a young online bookseller called Amazon was busy doing something even more dangerous. It was rebuilding the Sears catalog for the internet age. Amazon's entire model, an endless selection of everything, delivered to your door at honest prices with a guarantee, was the Sears catalog reborn in software. Sears, of all companies, should have recognized its own reflection. It had pioneered exactly this, selling everything to everyone from a central warehouse, a full century before Jeff Bezos. But Sears did not race to reclaim the territory it had invented. It had a recognized brand, a vast store network, valuable real estate, and the deepest history in mail-order retail of any company alive, every ingredient needed to fight for the digital future. Instead of pouring its resources into one unified push to become the everything store online, Lampert turned the company's attention inward. The conclusion that Sears had real assets and a real brand was correct. The lesson Lampert drew from it, that the way to unlock their value was to make the divisions compete against each other rather than march together against Amazon, was catastrophically wrong. This is where Sears made the decision that made everything else inevitable. In 2008, Lampert formally restructured the company under a model called Sears Holdings Organization, Actions, and Responsibilities, or SOAR. The company was carved into more than 30 units: apparel, tools, appliances, electronics, footwear, human resources, information technology, even the company's own brands and store support functions. Each became an autonomous business with its own leadership, its own board, and its own bottom line. Crucially, each unit's executives were paid based on the profit of their unit alone, not the profit of Sears as a whole. The structure had been tried at sprawling industrial conglomerates like General Electric, but never at a retailer, where the entire point is that the customer experiences one store. And then Lampert sat back and waited for the invisible hand to work its magic. It is the years after 2008, and Sears is tearing itself apart from the inside. The units, told to act selfishly and rewarded for it, do exactly as they are told. Executives begin actively undermining other divisions because their bonuses depend on their own units' numbers and nothing else. The appliance division and the tools division, which a shopper experiences as a single seamless store, now treat each other as rivals to be beaten. When one unit wants to run an advertisement, it must negotiate to buy space in the company's own weekly circular from the division that controls it, and the units fight bitterly over who pays what. The group that owns the Sears brand name charges the other divisions a fee simply to use the word Sears. Units refuse to share customer data with one another because data is an advantage and you do not hand your advantage to a competitor. One executive wanted to photograph a product for an ad and discover he had to pay another Sears division for the photo studio, so he used an outside vendor instead. Another recalled that the Kenmore appliance team grew reluctant to feature its products prominently in the Sears stores because doing so helped the store's division more than its own bottom line. And so a Sears-owned brand began quietly favoring rival retailers that paid better. The stories from inside became almost unbelievable. Former executives described meetings that turned into open warfare, with division heads protecting their own turf while the company around them bled. One called the divisions warring tribes. Another said cooperation and collaboration had simply been eliminated. A business journalist who interviewed more than 40 former executives, many from the highest levels of the company, concluded that if the model resembled any book, it was less Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged than it was The Hunger Games. The single most valuable thing Sears had ever possessed, the willingness of a tools manager and a clothing manager to sacrifice a little for the store they shared, simply dissolved. There was no longer one company with one strategy. There were 30 companies fighting over a shrinking pile of money, and every one of them was rational, and together they were doomed. But it gets worse, because the infighting was draining the company's energy at the exact moment it needed every ounce of it pointed outward. While Sears executives spent their days negotiating internal contracts and protecting their units' numbers, Amazon was compounding, growing relentlessly, swallowing category after category of the everything store market that Sears had invented and then abandoned. Walmart kept grinding on price from the other side. A unified Sears, with all its scale and brand and real estate aimed in one direction, might have carved out a real place in the new world, the way other legacy retailers eventually did. A Sears at war with itself never even entered the fight. Its leaders were too busy fighting each other to fight anyone else. And Lampert's response made the bleeding worse. As the company lost money year after year, he did what a hedge fund manager does. Rather than invest heavily in the stores, he let them rot. Shoppers who walked into a Sears in those years found dim lighting, water-stained ceilings, empty shelves, broken escalators, and so few staff that checking out could take 20 minutes. The stores became a national symbol of decline. Meanwhile, Lampert used the company's cash for enormous stock buybacks that propped up the share price in the short term, and he steadily sold off or spun out the company's most valuable parts. The crown jewels went one by one. The Land's End clothing brand was spun off to shareholders. The Craftsman tool brand, a name synonymous with American quality for 90 years, was eventually sold to Stanley Black & Decker. Most significantly of all, Sears sat on an enormous portfolio of valuable real estate, hundreds of store properties in prime locations, and that real estate was carved off into a separate company, with Sears then paying rent to occupy the very buildings it had once owned. Critics argued, and creditors would later allege in federal court, that Lampert was methodically stripping the most valuable assets out of Sears and into entities that he and his hedge fund controlled, while the retail operation itself was hollowed out and left to fail. A group of creditors would eventually accuse him of orchestrating a years-long scheme to transfer billions in value away from the dying company and to work himself. Whether it was a deliberate liquidation dressed up as a turnaround, or simply the natural instinct of a financier who genuinely saw a company as a pile of assets to be optimized rather than a living organization to be nurtured. The result on the ground was identical. The stores kept closing, the workforce kept shrinking, and the losses kept mounting, more than $10 billion over the span of several years. You would think someone would have stopped it. The man in charge was the one taking it apart. By the time the end came, there was very little left to save. Sales had collapsed. Over the preceding decade and a half, Sears had lost roughly half its revenue and laid off nearly 175,000 people, and it had closed dozens upon dozens of stores in wave after wave of shutdowns, each one announced quietly in a press release that read like an obituary. The company that once handled 100,000 orders a day at Christmas could no longer reliably keep its shelves stocked. On October 15, 2018, Sears Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, more than 130 years after Richard Sears sold his first watch off a railroad platform. The retailer that had once been the largest in the world, that had built the tallest building on earth, that had clothed and furnished and insured generations of American families, could no longer pay its bills. In a final twist that captured the entire saga, Lampert's own hedge fund, ESL Investments, stepped in and bought the surviving pieces of Sears out of bankruptcy for around $5.2 billion, keeping a few hundred stores alive under his continued control and preserving tens of thousands of jobs at least for a while. Creditors were furious. A group of them went to court alleging that Lampert had orchestrated a multi-year, multifaceted scheme to strip the company's assets and profit from its decline. The same man profiting on the way down that he had profited on the way in. Lampert, for his part, remained entirely unrepentant, insisting to the end that decentralized systems produce better information than centralized ones, and that the clashes between his divisions had been healthy competition that weak, socialist-minded companies sorely lacked. Today, Sears barely exists. From a peak of 2,705 stores in 2011, the chain has collapsed to a literal handful, around 5 stores still operating in the entire United States. The Craftsman tools that filled American garages are made by another company now. The Kenmore name has faded. The Sears Tower, the building that announced the company's dominance to the world, was renamed the Willis Tower in 2009 after a London insurance broker, so that the structure no longer even bears the name of the company that built it. The wish book that taught American children to dream at Christmas is a collector's item. At its peak, Sears employed roughly 350,000 people and was, without competition, the place where America shopped. Now it is a brand on life support, its name attached to a few surviving stores and a portfolio of real estate worth more than the retailer that sits on it. The company that invented the art of selling everything to everyone was buried, in the end, by a company that did precisely that on the internet. Sears did not die because the market changed, though it did. Sears died because a man who believed that cooperation was weakness took the single greatest cooperative machine in the history of American retail and ordered its parts to turn on one another. The catalog worked because a marketing genius and an organizer and a tools clerk and a watch repairman all pulled in the same direction, each covering for what the others lacked. The invisible hand cannot build a company. It can only divide one. The hand that built Sears was 2 hands, clasped, a dreamer and an organizer who needed each other. Eddie Lampert spent more than a decade proving a single thing, that when you reward the parts of an organization for fighting each other, You do not get a leaner, sharper company. You get a company that finishes, with its own hands, the job its competitors had only just begun.